Welcome to the Watch Symposia series. I'm Steve Rogenstein, based in Berlin, Germany. Honeybee Watch's project director and your host today. And our co-host is Arrigo Moro, the science director of Honeybee Watch. So in the interest of time, I'm going to briefly introduce Honeybee Watch. We're an international coalition tasked with better understanding how and why free-living honeybees survive via natural selection with little to no human intervention. And by free-living honeybees, we mean bees that have chosen to live where they have chosen to live. So not managed and not treated, and basically those living with little to no human intervention. So we started in 2020. And in the 4 years, our research partners and participating citizen scientists have identified more than 2,000 nest sites on 5 continents, and we keep growing those numbers. And it's very exciting for us because we have not done a lot of promotions or communications about Honeybee Watch. So when we finally get those resources to invest in communications, we hope that those numbers will jump exponentially. With those data, those more than 2,000 nest sites, we've collaborated with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, to reassess the red list status of Apis mellifera in Europe. And that will conclude very soon. We've been working on that for about 2 years, and we're going to publish a report, or actually they will, so stay tuned. We hope to have exciting news related to that. And beyond other activities like organizing the Symposia series, we are now applying for grants to fund research around the world, to strengthen our organization, and expand hopefully into Africa, the Middle East, and underrepresented countries in Europe like the Baltics and Balkans, and elsewhere, South America, the Americas, etc. So to introduce today's symposium, it's titled, Are Wild Honeybees Wild Bees Too? And some of you find that to be a very obvious question, very rhetorical, but there's controversy around this, and that's something that we hope to discuss and explore today. So with all of our topics, we try to have our finger on the pulse and explore issues relevant to our field of study, namely around free-living honeybees, and really kind of address these topics that colleagues are talking about or are challenged by. For this one in particular, we wanted to confront an issue head-on and not shrink from its potential controversy. And that is the notion that honeybees are competing with other bee species for resources, namely nectar and pollen. I see, Rebecca, you nodding your head, and you know all about this with the melipona in Yucatan. So as we dove deeper into this issue, its complexity became really clear. So intertwined with the issue of competition are these other kind of sub-issues of native versus alien, the degree of honeybees' invasiveness in different geographic settings. Jamie is representing the Americas. We have Kit, who's representing Australia. These are lands that are not the original geographic range of Apis mellifera. So they are, non-native, invasive, call it what you may, but that's not where they came from. So there's a level of kind of controversy there. And then also another one of these sub-issues is their effects on other species. So in this 2-hour symposium, obviously we're not going to get enough time to dive deep into all of these subtopics and try to unpack all these layers. It's not going to happen. So what we'll do, though, is with these 3 experts, we hope that they represent a diversity of perspectives, expertise, and opinions. And through especially the panel discussion, we hope to ask questions that really target the issues. So Jamie comes from the US. He chairs the entomology department at Ohio State University and teaches there too. I first saw Jamie present a talk in a webinar that was hosted by Ohio State University in their entomology department. I don't remember the details, sorry for that, but I think it was about bumblebees and citizen science. And what I was really struck by was his very friendly demeanor and very accessible presentation style. So no pressure on you, Jamie, but that is expected today. And then when we started talking, it didn't take long to realize that he'd be perfect for the symposium. He started researching honeybees at the USDA, Department of Agriculture, and studied them as well in France. Eventually led to stints in labs and universities elsewhere, and then started shifting to studying native bees in the US, and in particular, their population rehabilitation and conservation for bumblebees. I believe you run a bumblebee lab. You can talk more about that. And what I particularly appreciate about Jamie is that he straddles the worlds of honeybees and other native bees and represents, like I said, the geographic perspective where Apis mellifera is an introduced species. But he also clearly understands that there are differences between managed and wild honeybee populations and respects the latter. So I am going to give you the floor. I'm going to give you also, let's say, 14 minutes. And I will give you a little warning when you have 1 minute left. Okay?
All right, thanks, Steve.
All right, go for it.
All right, well, I'm not going to spend too much time on this title slide, but just to recap, sort of thinking about the idea of this question of our wild honeybees, wild bees, and seems like a simple question, but of course it's not. But before I get into that, I kind of want to cover some of my background. As Steve alluded to the fact that I've had a foot in both the Apis mellifera and non-Apis mellifera worlds at various times in my career. And it really kind of started back when I was in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was an undergraduate at Pennsylvania State University, and I took a honeybee biology course there as a student, and really kind of that's kind of what got me to really think like, wow, bees are something I might want to spend my life studying. Um, and then I really from there kind of took off. And I worked for a few years right out of my undergrad for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and this is kind of the one of the first hints at where a lot of my mind goes. Well, I worked on a project where we were growing alfalfa or lucerne, I think is what some of the European folks call it, this forage crop. It's very important, and it's also dependent on bees for pollination. And the bees we worked with at the time, I made that switch from being really fascinated with honeybees to sort of learning very quickly that there are a lot of other bee species in the world, over 20,000. But the one we were working with was the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, and interestingly, it's also in North America a non-native species. So it was the story is it was accidentally introduced, but it may have been brought here intentionally. One way or the other, it made its way to North America, and it's used very extensively and it's very important for the production of this forage crop, for which a lot of our animals are dependent on, especially cattle. Also, at that sort of this time I kind of discovered, well, I didn't discover them, but I realized that there were all these native bees. I was working out in these fields looking at pollination, and we had these things like bumblebees that were on these fields, and we had alkali bees that were flying around that were also doing a lot of this sort of pollination work in these areas. And at that time, I don't remember if I found it or somebody handed me a copy of the book, The Forgotten Pollinators by Steve Buckman and Gary Nabam. And that was like also kind of eye-opening to be like, oh, there's all these other bees I didn't know about. And so kind of exciting for me to kind of discover these things. And I decided, maybe I didn't want to be a technician doing this work in the field, but maybe I wanted to be a scientist looking at bees and the work they did. And so at that point, I applied to and got into graduate school at Washington State University. And there in the late 90s, there was really no funding to study native bees. No one, some of you will be shocked to hear that no one cared about native bees that much. at that point. But there was money to study honeybees and specifically varroa mite impacts on honeybees. And so I started with my master's degree really studying varroa mite control in honeybees, and it had a lot of fun. It was great. I was killing mites. I killed probably a lot of bees too during this time, but it was very exciting. And then I had the opportunity to kind of switch gears and look at kind of for my PhD population genetics and some of the ecology of honeybees in France. So I actually spent a year, 2 summers, and a bunch of other months in Southwest France studying this Lalande ecotype of Apis mellifera mellifera, the black bees. And it was really fascinating. There was these heather bees in this heather system. They had highly adapted to this late summer blooming crop of honey, and really fascinating system, and was able to kind of dive into how these bees persisted on the landscape and how they were adapted to it. And so um, after that, I returned to the United States, finished my PhD, did a brief postdoc down the road from where Tom Seeley, I saw Tom's on here. Hi, Tom. Just down the street from him, I was at Cornell University working with Nick Calderone, and again, kind of looking at some of the more applied aspects of apiculture. But at that point, I got a job with USDA, and I moved out to Utah, which is, for those of you who know, in the mountainous west of the United States. Um, and there I worked as a research entomologist for 13 years. And the job really it was the Logan Bee Lab, as we call it, is a native, well, more or less a native bee lab. It does do some alfalfa leaf cutting bee work, which again, a non-native. But I was hired to work on native bumblebees. And right around the time I got hired, people around the country and in North America were beginning to document declines in native bumblebees, and seeing, in fact, some places where they were really disappearing very quickly off of the landscape. Um, and I was hired to focus on these. I was hired to focus on the native bumblebees, but their management, their health, looking at parasites and pathogens. And also, I wanted to look at the genetics of them and how different bumblebee species had evolved in North America, where they're actually a nice, pretty diverse group. And also, were there ways that we could kind of combat these losses we'd been seeing, or that we just started seeing? So a lot of my early work really shifted at that point to going out and surveying and seeing where they were, which species were disappearing. And we did a lot of work kind of documenting these declines. And some species in North America, it's interesting because some bumblebee species have really taken some pretty big hits as far as their population. And we have at least two species, which are federally listed as endangered, a number of others that are under review. Um, but then we also have some species that are really abundant and common and widespread across the landscape. And in fact, we have one North American species, the common eastern bumblebee, which is produced commercially. It is shipped throughout the Americas, or at least throughout North America, for pollination, mostly of greenhouse crops, glasshouse crops for those of you in Europe. But it's important for protected cultivation, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, anything that's grown in protected cultivation. They're in North America, probably the bee of choice. We worked in the lab. My lab worked at developing but they are native only to the eastern United States, and Canada. So that's an important aspect. They're not native west in North America, or to Mexico, but people were shipping them to these places, and that was a concern. It's a concern both for introduction of this non-native species, but also for the spread of pathogens. And we had reason to believe that some of the declines we were seeing in the native bumblebees, were related to this spread of pathogens. So that's again, a little bit of where my thinking goes when I am really cautious about the movement of bees across landscapes, because when you move bees, you move everything that's with them, in them, on them, that's in the hive that you may not have any control over. And so that was something we worked on. So we developed, two Western species we worked a lot on developing for pollination and commercialization, and both of them have been picked up to some degree by the industry. And I would hope they get pushed more in the Western U.S. and we use more regionally appropriate bumblebees for pollination, that rather than just shipping bees all over the place. So that's what I did, and there, and then in about 2019, I had the opportunity to leave there and move to Ohio to become chair of the Department of Entomology here at Ohio State University. And I did that. And when I came, I also established I didn't just want to do administration. So I brought a lab with me and set up the Bumblebee Health and Genetics Lab. Around the same time, we launched a project. I was starting on it when I was in Utah. Hollis Woodard at University of California, Riverside was the lead on this, but we were beginning to have this discussions around monitoring native bees around the United States. And of course, I had done a lot of monitoring of native bumblebees around the United States. So this was a group that I was really interested in participating in. And it kind of started off with 12 or 13 of us who were having discussions, and we got some funding, and we managed to run for 5 years a series of webinars and discussions, much like we're having today, around how one might do this, whether one even needs to monitor native bees, and what we might gain from it. And we're now moving into what we're calling kind of phase 2 of this project. So the first 5 years was really talking about it, gathering information, considering ideas. We now have a couple papers out for review and I think Steve sent the one paper around that was kind of the beginning of this project that you might have. So that we have developed a bunch of protocols for how one might monitor, what you might monitor, and why it's important, and those are out there. So but my goal now is really thinking about how bees use landscapes, and how do these landscapes then impact bee health, and those landscapes, of course, can contain all sorts of things. So going back to our initial question, though, are wild honeybees wild bees? And I would ask if this is even the right question. And I mentioned that I worked with bees that are also managed, and I would maybe say that are unmanaged honeybees wild bees, because we know there are a lot of managed honeybees in the world, and those are clearly I would think not, just like those bumblebees that are managed are not wild bees, just like those alfalfa leaf cutting bees I worked with are not wild bees. Once we manage them, I don't think they become managed bees. So, and then another question I think springs out of this, maybe we'll talk about it later, but should we even be trying to manage wild honeybees? And is that, one of the things we're doing? I did want to make a couple definitions really quickly as we move forward, this is how I think, so where my brain's at as we continue the discussion. But again, native species is a species that occurs at a place prior to human management or human mediated movement. So just because something's moved in and it's established in the wild does not make it a native species. A non-native species is kind of the opposite of that. It's something that has not from a place. Wild, I sort of think of that in the context of this question. I thought about it a bunch, and I really think it's something that is unmanaged by humans. So you can definitely be non-native, but if you occur on a landscape without intervention by humans, then that, to me, makes you wild. And feral, we talk about this a lot, and you hear about feral bees a lot in the United States. We talk about those that have escaped from human management, and then now persist without direct human intervention, but they would be non-native to that area. And we actually have a great instance of this in bumblebees too, where we have those that were once used for greenhouse pollination in British Columbia and Washington State have now escaped and established feral populations in the Northwest. So it's not just honeybees we see this with. We see it with bumblebees, and we've seen it with leafcutter bees and others as well. And we've even seen it with things like mason bees, these solitary bees that were brought in for pollination and have now escaped, and in some places really supplanted the native mason bee species that were in those areas. So the movement of bees, and when I say movement of bees, I mean all bees, is actually problematic, and it has some real consequences that we've seen here in the United States pretty starkly in some cases. And then, of course, we have invasive species. So that's a non-native species to a place that has escaped humans. And generally, when I use that term, I'm thinking of something that's having negative, quantifiable negative impacts, and or causing disruptions to natural ecosystems. And we can talk more about that. We have some examples of those in bees as well in North America.
Jamie,
Of course.
Jamie, you have about 1 minute.
All right. Well, I'm gonna work forward to wrapping up. Of course, we have managed species, which they could be either native or non-native. We have examples of that in North America, both native and non-native species, which are manipulated by humans, and where we're working to increase or maintain populations for a purpose, which is generally pollination or honey production. And then unmanaged bees. Again, that can be all of the native and non-native species, but we're really where humans are not manipulating those at all. So are our unmanaged honeybees, wild bees, and I would say yes, but that does not mean that they have no impacts on an ecosystem. It doesn't mean that that there's no management that we might do around those. You certainly could think about intentional plantings or even mapping them, which is a sort of form of management in itself. In non-native regions like the Americas and Australia, we know that honeybees can have impacts on wild bees, and that can be both competition, it can be spread of disease. There may be other things that we don't even really think about right now, but that are happening. One more slide. Can I do that? Steve. Okay. I'm going to do it anyway.
Do it.
So, I think about this too. Like, I really come from this agricultural perspective, but I've worked a lot in natural resources. And I think that when we have discussions like this, it's important to acknowledge that managed pollinators are necessary for agricultural pollination. Like, that's a reality. We all like fruits and vegetables. And I think they're important to have managed bees in these if we want to continue having agriculture. But also protecting our natural resources is an equally important objective. And native bees are a natural resource, and we should be cognizant of that. There's also the reality that people's livelihoods depend on bees, and not just honeybees. They depend on bumblebees, they depend on mason bees, they depend on leafcutter bees that are all produced by various people and sold commercially. And we can't discount that and just say, let's get rid of all these, managed bees. We need those. And that also compromises on all sides really truly have to be made if you're going to make progress on protecting both the natural resources and our agricultural systems. So I will leave it with that and look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Jamie. I was really hoping that you would go in the middle because you do have this balance between wild and managed and understanding, yes, compromises are necessary and managed pollinators are necessary for food security and for agricultural output. So I think that that's something that we need to take into consideration in the big picture of conservation and protection of certain populations. So thank you, Jamie. Great presentation. I like that you contextualize it through your history, lots of big issues, and hopefully we'll discuss some of them during the panel discussion.